So we all know Slayer didn't exactly end the 1990s, that decade, on a high note. And with touring commitments with Ozfests and things of that regard, it was taking some time for Slayer to kind of get back into the studio and buckle down hard on crafting their first new album since the Albus and Musica. And they know that they wanted to come in with a new attitude. They wanted to come in with a little bit more to offer. And they knew by doing that they had to step away from Rick Rubin and find somebody who was a little bit more geared toward the heavy metal market, which Rubin had quickly not become. There were other problems that really helped this album to not see the light of day until the date in which it did. Originally, the release date of God Hates Us All, which was not even the original title of the album, it was originally entitled Soundtrack for the Apocalypse, which would be used for the Slayer box set in 2003. There were problems and questions about the audio, about the mixing, about American records changing imprints and getting taken over, and it's just a lot of different factors actually caused this album to not make the July 10th intended release date, causing it instead to have that date changed to September the 11th of 2001. Think about that date. Of course, you don't have to. It's a date that's within your mind regardless. It's been certainly pounded into the heads of probably just about every world citizen enough times to understand what 9/11/01 is all about, the September 11th attacks in America. This album, entitled God Hates Us All, was released the same day as one of the worst attacks in American history. So, of course, this was an album that immediately sparked controversy. Of course, this album's title was one that immediately sparked outrage. And this album itself was one that really sparked a lot of attention. And you would think that that would be a great thing. You would think that that would be kind of what Slayer wanted, but think about it. Think about making your grand return and having your album essentially being used as the butt of irony jokes. Isn't it ironic that Slayer's God Hates Us All is released the same day as one of the worst attacks in American history? Doesn't it seem fitting? Doesn't it seem like, perhaps, Slayer are onto something? We're not here to discuss the politics of the album, even though we just discussed quite a bit. We're here to talk about the music itself. Was this Slayer's grand return in the new millennium? Is this an album that sort of put the band back on the right foot after Diabolus and Musica kind of turned a lot of people away? Even though it was an album that was purely experimental, something that Jeff Hanneman kind of just wanted to try. Well, in a way, it did. In a way, it definitely turned things around for the band after the less than popular Diabolus that preceded it. It certainly ushered in a lot more of the way of Slayer fans from some of the youth that were starting to reach the teenage years. But this was also an album that had a lot of aid from something kind of unlikely, and that was the nu metal movement. Diabolus and Musica actually showcased Slayer's ability and Slayer's kind of twinge and little leapfrog into potential nu metal territory. And it's something that it seems so strange to even lace them as a part of, but it's something where some of the very simplistic constructions on that album made people sort of draw the comparison, even though that wasn't the direct intention, and even though Slayer's thrash sound has a heavier property than a lot of the nu metal bands that came out in the late 90s. But by 2001, this was something where that aggressive edge and simplistic nature was going to draw those comparisons, even if they were unintended, which they certainly 100% were. The music itself on this album is started off with the minute and 30-second long introduction, Darkness of Christ, that moves into Disciple. Disciple was Grammy Award nominated, lost to Schism by Tool, but you can immediately tell why it was. This is a thunderous, thunderous chorus, just blasts through this song lyrically and musically. It's like a sonic explosion to begin this album. Remember what we have said about Rain and Blood. Remember what we said about how that album with Angel of Death started off with such fury and ferocity that it didn't really matter what came after it. It was something where that material was supported just as well, but was accented even higher. And accented and made more important because of Angel of Death's true legendary status. Was the same true of Disciple? It certainly had the twinge. The problem is that, for one, there isn't a Raining Blood to support it on the other side of the bookend. Payback is nowhere close to that song. Payback is nowhere close to Raining Blood. And secondly, the supporting material that was in between, the books that are between the bookends, don't have anywhere near the same level of importance or the same level of songwriting prowess as the Rain in Blood disaster piece, the Rain in Blood time bomb really had. Because that's what Rain in Blood was. It felt like a time bomb since it was so short. It felt like as you were listening to each and every song, you were counting down moments until the bomb just exploded. And then that happened with Raining Blood. You don't get that on here. On here you do have a lot of aggression. You do have a lot of anger. There's just a lot of swearing, which is something that is really boosted up in terms of what Slayer has done. There's a lot of anger and a lot of speech about, and a lot of rhetoric about religion, about war, and things like that. And this is an album, actually, where instead of it being something that's true of, let's say, Seasons of the Abyss or South of Heaven before it, this is the album where self-parody started to become more of a reality than when people were actually saying that self-parody was occurring within the Slayer catalog. This is one where the band had a real opportunity to kind of reinvent themselves a little bit, reinvent the wheel. Think about how Exodus's albums from the 2000s really reinvented their sound, reinvented their name, and made them a hugely vital, important part of the thrash metal revival. Now, yes, granted, they had a lot more time away from it in order for people to get sort of excited by this, but the songwriting also boosted something that was very, very unique, and they just had a new sinister snarl to them. With Slayer, the sinister snarl is instead kind of replaced with just a tongue full of hate, a tongue full of anger, intermixed with music that sounds like a little bit more of the same, a little bit closer to that classic Slayer approach, but also maintaining some of those twinges, some of those simplistic urges of what is recent, what is current, what is new metal. Sounds like heresy, but there's a bit of truth to it. Consider some of the simplistic structures. Consider how some of these songs sort of give you that same tone as to bands that you were hearing on the radio at that time, only with a much harder edge, only with a much harder property, guitar solos that were actually a bit adventurous, not to mention lyricism that would never have been PC for the radio. And you have, essentially, God Hates Us All. You have an album that had a lot of potential. You have an album that actually, when compared to Diabolus and Musica, definitely executed that potential. You have an album that many people love because of the last thing that they heard from this band. What happened with this band because of September 11th, it was almost cool to listen to this album and love this album because it showcased that you were in the know and you're not going to be affected by the media or the religious persecution or this or that or these or whatever. And then think about the fact that you've been clamoring, a lot of fans have been clamoring for an album that had this level of just sheer attitude and sheer speed and snarl ever since, say, Seasons in the Abyss. Yeah. That's what this is all about. That's why the legend is actually somewhat true, that this is an album that definitely helped Slayer sort of resurface like a phoenix. But it really isn't all of that great of an album. It really isn't all of that consistent. It's one that is consistent only within its ferocity and its hate. But it's not one that really, on a musical sense, in a musical property, is really viable to be really whispered within the same sentence as the first 5 Slayer albums. Slayer was back. Slayer had already caused controversy. Slayer now needed to follow it up. Slayer would take some time to do that. Slayer would wait until the middle part of the 2000s. And whenever they did that, they would be without Paul Bostoff. And they would instead turn to an old friend to help them out. Yeah, Dave Lombardo. And the result, as far as the album was, that came from that, was Christ Illusion. Did Christ Illusion further the Slayer legend any, or did Christ Illusion kind of do something a little different? Stay tuned. We're going to talk about that next.